Hey, I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to the Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So in one of our very early episodes, we tried to answer the question of what work could look like as more and more people get vaccinated and whether we could keep working from home, since a lot of us had gotten used to the increased flexibility and the many other benefits that come with working remotely. And the solution a lot of companies and employees were looking to was a hybrid model of work, some of the week at home and the rest in the office. Now, we're really starting to see companies introduce this model. We're doing it at the Globe, maybe your office is doing it too. But as great as remote work was, in some ways, it also has its downsides. It means you're not a presence in the office. And if you're out of sight, it could also mean you're out of mind when it comes to cool assignments and promotions. And as we transition to the hybrid model, experts worry that this absence from the office and the consequences of that will hit one group more than everyone else, and that's women.
For a woman, there might be this fear that, you know what, I'm not in the office, I don't have the benefit of FaceTime, I already felt overlooked at work before the pandemic, and now I'm going to feel absolutely invisible.
Rita Tritcher is a business columnist for the Globe and Mail, and she wrote a column on this recently. Rita's on the show today, and we're going to talk about how women might be impacted by the shift to a hybrid model of work and what companies could do to make sure they're not left behind. You're listening to The Decibel. Rita, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So Rita, what made you want to write this column about remote work and the transition to a hybrid model?
Oh, well, they always say to write about what you know. And of course, I am a working mother. I'm also a family caregiver. And this has been on my mind a lot. And it's also been on the minds of a lot of the women who I speak to. And I thought to myself, what is this going to mean for women and their career trajectories at work? Are we going to become more invisible? Mm-hmm. Because we already feel overlooked. So what is this going to mean? You know, this is an important topic for us to be talking about right now because so many companies are talking about making that transition to hybrid workplaces. So you're a working mom, and how did working remotely help you over the course of the pandemic? Well, I suppose the fact that I didn't have to commute into work was a time saver. It did help manage the family obligations, particularly when schools shut down.
Yeah.
Or when there was an outbreak in one of my children's classrooms, because that did happen. Even with school going on, other people's children were in class, but, you know, there were times, and I know that our family is far from the only family to go through this, where you get that note saying you can't bring your child to class, there's an outbreak, everybody has to go get tested, you know, your children have to self-isolate for the 2-week period. And that's a lot of chaos. It became impossible to plan. And virtual school in the beginning really fell on the parents. And so trying to work, trying to feed the children, trying to stay on top of everything, not having to physically be in the office, that was a help, for sure.
Yeah, I imagine if you had to go into the office, that would have been a nightmare.
It would have been. And, you know, I'm a caregiver. I'm an essential caregiver to my younger brother, who is actually in long-term care. The stress of that situation, because it was a period of time where we couldn't go in to see him, right, prior to vaccinations. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there was COVID in his home, and dealing with the stress of not knowing whether he would contract the illness. Also, you know, helping my parents cope with that. You know, my parents are in their 80s, and it was a lot. Yeah. So not physically having to be in the office did help manage those family responsibilities.
So before we start talking about this transition to the hybrid model, I wonder if we can kind of lay some groundwork. So at this point in the pandemic, what do we know about the kind of impact it's had on women in the labor force?
So we know that during the first wave of COVID-19 in Canada in North America that women were disproportionately affected by the layoffs. And we know that women are overrepresented in the service sector, which was hard hit. So, restaurants and other, customer facing roles, they were hard hit. Women lost their jobs disproportionately. A lot of young women were affected and disproportionately affected by those layoffs too. So the youngest of working women, dealt with a huge loss right from the beginning. And at one point, Royal Bank of Canada had estimated that something like 3 decades of women's advancement in the workplace had been wiped out in a relatively short period of time. Now, we have seen some of those jobs come back, and we have seen people return to the workforce. But as the pandemic was grinding on, a lot of women found themselves in a very difficult position. They had to make a decision. Do I go back to work or do I apply for another job and try to find something else? Can I count on schools being there? Can I count on childcare? Or is it, to preserve my sanity and just the functioning of our family, does it make more sense for me to take a step back temporarily and, allow my partner to be the breadwinner at this time, just until the uncertainty wears down?
Right. And so now a lot of companies are preparing to bring people back through a hybrid model. What does that mean? What are we talking about when we say hybrid model?
So the hybrid model is a system where you have some of your employees working from home and some who are working in the office at any given time. And it could be that your employees mix it up, that some of them work from home a couple of days a week, and then they come into the office to work for a couple of days a week. Or you have people who are always working from home, and you'll also have people who are always working in the office. So it is this idea that at any given time, a company is going to have employees either working remotely or in person.
Okay, so in theory, this seems good because it would save companies money and it would give employees a lot more flexibility, right? But your column zooms in on one of the dangers of this transition, and it's about the way that the hybrid model could impact women. And so what is the worry around that?
So the worry is that you will have companies say, yes, we're transitioning to hybrid workplaces. We are going to get rid of office space. You will be able to come in when it suits you, and work from home when it suits you. That itself is not the problem. The problem is when you say, here's this policy, you can take advantage of it, but then you don't actually adjust your corporate culture to match that policy, so that there's still this fear that the underlying expectation is, this policy of flexible working is actually just for women. And if you as a man take advantage of that, your commitment to your job might be in question. And for a woman, there might be this fear that, I'm not in the office. I don't have the benefit of FaceTime. I already felt overlooked at work before the pandemic, and now I'm going to feel absolutely invisible. Think of all the times you've seen people just gathered around, just as an example, like the smoking pool, right? It starts off as a casual conversation. People are shooting the breeze about what they did on the weekend. At some point, it can evolve into an actual work conversation, and where, actual decisions are made. Or, think of other scenarios where someone just drops into someone's office and says, hey, can I just bend your ear for a second? I think we need to pay a lot of attention to who is in the room and who isn't in the room, and making sure that we proactively include all of our colleagues in that discussion.
And I've also read, anecdotally, women saying that they have a hard time speaking up in virtual meetings, or whenever they try to say something, they're kind of ignored. And it's easier to be ignored when you're doing meetings over a video conferencing platform.
I think in in-person meetings, we see that dynamic too. There's always extroverted people who will dominate the conversation. I think that dynamic does also play out in virtual meetings. But one thing that Sarah Kaplan, the Rotman professor, pointed out to me, she suggested that, at least with Zoom, everybody gets their own square, and all the squares are the same size, generally speaking. I know sometimes when you are the actual speaker, your particular square becomes bigger, but there's a level of visual equity there that perhaps didn't exist before.
Yeah.
Some people just take up more space in person. And the other thing she, mentioned is when we were all required to work from home, those of us that, have jobs were able to work from home. That also put people on a more equal footing in terms of access to information. If you wanted mentoring, if you needed to find something out, we were all kind of faced with that same, how do I find out this piece of information from my boss? Now, it's not 100% perfect solution, of course, because it's true. You still have people whose reflex it is to just, loop in certain people on an email. You can still be left off an email or a Slack message. But it was a little bit more equal than I think what we were experiencing in person.
Right. And I guess with this hybrid model, the fear is that the people who go into the office will have access to information faster, and then they'll end up looking more competent or something.
Absolutely. It's this idea that, FaceTime might still matter more than your actual output. And that's problematic.
Yeah. What about women who are earlier in their careers who maybe don't have kids, but they want to take the remote work option? And I ask partly for myself because I fall into that category, and I definitely want to work from home as much as possible.
I think young women have had a really difficult time during this pandemic. They were among the first to lose their jobs and have been disproportionately affected. Their earnings have been impacted. And that's a pretty devastating blow. And so if they're back in the workforce now and they're trying to make their mark, and this option is presented to them, you can work from home, and it sounds like a great option. And this doesn't matter if you have children or not, or if you're a caregiver or not. You opt for this because it's a valid choice. I think some people will be wondering, is this going to count against me later? Is there going to be some unspoken rule or assumption made about me and my commitment to my job? I really hope that that's not the case. And I think companies can do a lot to mitigate that by making sure the policies they have in place are aligned with their corporate cultures, and also making sure that women and men have an open dialogue with their immediate managers.
For a lot of racialized people, remote work has meant that they can avoid a lot of racism in the workplace. And I've had a lot of conversations with people about what a relief this has been mentally for them in that sense. And a lot of people of color don't want to go back to the office for that reason. And I wonder if we can apply this thinking to racialized workers, and should they be worried about the same thing?
I read this article that I didn't include a link to it in my piece, but it talked about how the forced social distancing during the pandemic, during the lockdowns, actually was a relief for a lot of racialized workers because you were freed from a lot of the microaggressions that you might experience on a daily basis in the workplace. Mm-hmm. And, people were forced to communicate with you digitally. And, some of those more subtle incidents where you can't quite put your finger on it, but something's wrong and you feel as if the person is trying to let you know that you don't belong, that was reduced. I won't say that it was eliminated entirely, but a lot of people did feel that way, that sometimes it's better not to be faced with that on a daily basis. But it does raise the concern, if that is the case, this is, again, a corporate culture issue, microaggressions. If your company is not proactively dealing with that sort of thing, are you going to find then that your in-person workforce is overwhelmingly white male? I don't know. Are you going to have that diversity? Is it going to actually be an equitable workplace?
Okay, so what do businesses have to do to ensure that women and employees of color aren't left behind as a result of this transition to a hybrid model of work?
Okay, I think we're going to see that the solutions that businesses use will evolve over time. But just as a starting point, I'm going to point to the example of the bank that I highlighted in my column. They're thinking really strategically about the in-person office space and having it equipped with video equipment as an example, and ensuring that their employees have a variety of different technology tools at their disposal so that they can participate. So we also have to rethink how companies hand out promotions. There's thinking from US researchers out of Harvard that talks about reversing the onus when it comes to the promotions process. And what that means is instead of relying on a system where people have to throw their hat in the ring and promote for themselves and say, yes, I'm going to put up my hand. I want that job. I'm going to apply for it and I'm going to lobby for it. That reversing the onus to put it on the company to automatically consider all qualified candidates for a position unless the individual chooses to opt out. And what that does is you have a deeper talent pool of candidates that you can consider for an advancement opportunity. And it forces the company to look at every individual who is qualified rather than just relying on the person who feels the most comfortable promoting themselves at work.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I can see how that would make a huge difference. Like self-promotion is a very difficult thing for a lot of people to do.
Yes, perky self-promotion comes naturally to some, but it does not come naturally to others. And some of us have actually, quite frankly, been raised, not to be a self-promoter. I mean, that,
Totally.
My family is from India, and being humble and being deferential is just how I was raised, right? So it's to unlearn that, because that's not how it necessarily functions at work. It's a mindset shift, and not everyone is particularly skilled at that. And I think that, companies have a responsibility to ensure that they are creating equity in their workplaces, that they're setting people up to succeed and not to fail. And I'm talking about both men and women here, and that also they have a responsibility in terms of changing social mores to a certain extent. I mean, it's easy to say, okay, ladies, you just have to think very long and hard. If you're heterosexual and you want to get married, or if you want to live with somebody, you have to think very strategically about who your partner is. Or, I suppose the same would apply to if you're in a same-sex relationship as well. You have to think about, will your partner help you and split the housework? That's great. And of course, we should be encouraging our daughters and sisters and nieces to be very selective in their partner choices and have high standards. I absolutely agree. But, we can't tell women that and then have a whole social system in place that makes it impossible for them to actually succeed, where the expectation, the unwritten assumption is that really this is, your responsibility as a woman to just take on more of the load at home. And that's just too bad. That's the way it is.
Yeah. I wonder, what is the government's role in addressing that issue that's at the heart of this, which is this idea that we just assume that women will be the ones to bear the brunt of taking care of the kids and being the caregivers of the family.
Yeah, absolutely. There has to be some sort of a base standard. And right now, we don't even have companies, in Ontario, as an example, Ontario securities legislation doesn't even require companies to set diversity targets. We're still like in this spot where we just say, oh, well, it's a meritocracy, and if you are qualified for a promotion, you're going to get it if you work hard enough. I mean, let's get real. This has gone on for decades, and women still are underrepresented in the upper ranks of management, on boards. I mean, this is inequity. This is what inequity looks like. And when you add to that, intersectionality, whether it's race, whether it's sexual orientation, disability, many other factors, people continue to be extremely underrepresented. And you know what? That's not in the best interest of the corporation. Childcare is an issue in the election, and people are watching closely. But the question is we had this report on the status of women. It was a Royal Commission, I believe, like 50 years ago, recommend that there ought to be universal childcare in Canada. And 50 years later, we're still in this position where it's not in place. And quite frankly, I'm looking at my 11-year-old daughter, wondering, is she going to be in menopause by the time we have something in Canada?
Oh God.
Really, that's the slow pace of how this is going. And it's really unacceptable.
I wonder, do you have any practical advice for women who are worried about this?
Yes, I actually asked Linda Seymour. This is the CEO of the Canadian HSBC operations about this. What does she advise women to do? And it was very interesting. First, she prefaced her comments by saying, look, culture change in a company, it starts from the top. That's the responsibility. It starts with the tone from the top and it works its way down. That said, she encourages young women to push back against barriers at work because she said, you know what? We're at a point in time now where flexible work is actually widely accepted. It's actually something that a lot of companies are looking at. Push back against barriers at work because they may not be as insurmountable as you think they are. They might actually crumble. Have an open dialogue with your managers about what it is you need. So that was her piece of advice. Mm-hmm. My piece of advice, I'm 46. I feel like women need to be unapologetic about asking for what they need. We really do. No apologies, no explanations that you feel are somehow undermining you. Just be very clear with your manager that this is what I need to succeed in my job. And I'm saying this as someone who has been a manager and has been on the other side of it too. It's hard for your manager to know. They can't read minds. You have to articulate what you need and don't feel bad about it. This is about your career. This is about setting yourself up for success. Ask for what you need because, you might actually get it.
That's a great empowering note to end on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tamara.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Rita Tritcher. You can find Rita on Twitter at Rita, TRICHUR. If you want to email us, you can reach us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. If you haven't already, hit that follow button wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.